First World War. Victory had been ours, but we would soon fail at the peace that followed. Our leaders appeased the growing evil instead of fighting it, sacrificing our future. We vainly reinforced our borders with concrete while we evacuated our children from the cities. There was something terrible brewing with our old enemy, and no one seemed able to stop it. The world was about to find out what happens when an entire nation is swept by madness. What would you do? Surrender? Collaborate? Or resist?
Hello and welcome to my channel and to the story of Helene Deschamps, the secret agent whose story was the inspiration for the game Medal of Honor Underground. I want to tell her story and to look at the reality of an agent and how this has been translated to the game and the inspirations which bridge the gaps between, as well as review the game itself, one that started my own interest in this very story years ago. So I will tell Helene's story first and how it relates to the game. But the review will come after her story so I can talk freely about it all, and in slightly more depth. And it's through this work that she could help consult with the series, and now it's time to tell that story. Helene Deschamps was born in Tijan, China on January the 30th, 1921, the daughter of a French military man with whom she travelled to Africa and in the French colonies Madagascar and La Réunion. Something that, despite her strict upbringing, helped mould her and understand the differences in the world, and that adaptability would definitely prove useful later on. On the 10th of May, France was invaded by the Germans in Western Invasion, taking control of France in just 45 days, and on the 25th of June, where they simply outflanked the unfinished Maginot Line. That's the line of fortifications created around France after the First World War, named after General Maginot. At the end of the war, Marshal Pétain was declared the head of the Vichy government, the institution which would rule the majority of France until the 9th of August 1944 as a puppet state for the Nazis. And on the 18th of June 1940, General Charles de Gaulle, representing the Free French in Britain, made a speech calling for the French people to resist. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance should never be extinguished. I would love to have played a clip of this momentous event, but no such recording exists. But thankfully for this story, Helene, aged 19, heard this call to resist and decided that she had to do something, and so started to search for signs of the resistance. Her first flirtations involved a rather delusional professor named Anatole Mino under the alias Paulette Roland, but his open-mouthed discussion led directly to his housemaid going to talk to the police to denounce him, with young Helene running out the back door as soon as she saw them approaching and realising just how perilous a position could be, not just to the Gestapo or to the police, but to the local population themselves, happy to denounce those near them. That was not uncommon in Germany either, with the Gestapo having relatively fewer agents and relying on local information and denouncements. And if you wish to follow up this information, I advise watching The Brilliant Nazis, a Warning from History documentary from the BBC. It was on in the series 2000. I think it's on iPlayer. It's available to get for a little bit more understanding on exactly how they did this. It would take me far too long to detail this in more depth. However, I wish to talk a little about the French Vichy version of the Gestapo, the equally feared milice. Created on the 30th of January with Secretary General Joseph Demand, I do apologise for the pronunciation, at the helm. Its main job was to deport and round up Jews and opponents of the regime, such as communists or Free French, both trying to regain control of France and mould it in their own image. The Gestapo wanted a local organisation more suited to weeding out resistance members due to being familiar in dialect and locations the occupiers were not. They used the same tactics of interrogation as their big brother, but I will discuss this later a little bit more as well. And don't worry, I will ensure to leave a clear trigger warning with any parts at chapter the sections where I will discuss anything in more detail. There are a few parts of this that I will do that on, just simply because there's a few details that aren't, not everybody needs to hear such detail. So What I'll go through now is going into chapter 2. I think it'd be best to elaborate on elements of what she was involved in before she moves on and we go through her story. So with her disappointments from the initial attempt, she decided to use her father's old military connections to help her and turns to family friend Colonel Mackey, or Colonel Markey, I'm not exactly sure which way it is. She approaches him at his home, the colonel with his waxed moustache of a French military man, and in a stern tone tries to convince the young Helena that what she wants is just too dangerous. But despite his initial reservations, he realises she will act on her own, so wants to keep her where he can help her, and lets her start working for him. And it's now here I'll draw to the end of chapter 1, and we'll close Helena's early life, going into actual proper work when we're talking about working for the resistance themselves. And we'll look at that work in chapter 2, and how Medal of Honor also tries to reflect this at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Chapter 2. In winter 1940, Helena was given the codename H1 and was known under the alias Annick, and started to courier messages between Avignon, Nice and Montsac, working for the French Maquis. That's the resistance. The meaning of it is the men of the underbush. She was actually one of the few women to work for one of these organisations. It was very, very rare for this to be the case. So while doing this important work to keep track of German defensive positions and movements, she was approached by a younger sister to help her. And just like Colonel Markey said to her, she realised herself that Jackie would also want to be involved with the resistance work in terms of these tracking missions, etc. So decided to take her with her along to see Colonel Markey. And at this point they started to work together, passing messages. And then Helena was asked to go and do a slightly different job in Nice. It's just important to know that Jackie was involved in the work before she travels off. According to Helena, the Italian occupation in that part of France was a more relaxed affair in general, with the Italian troops more interested in French ladies themselves rather than jackbooted occupation, probably in part helped by the fact the Italians did not actually manage to get around to invading France, so Hitler gave them a theoretical part of the spoils that they might have got to save embarrassment for their junior partner for not actually taking part in the war. While spotting for the camp and looking to find a way to gain intelligence, she meets a Captain Alberti, someone who flirts and gives away information to Helena regarding troop movements, where they would be going, and details on the camp, with Helena admitting herself to be falling for the captain in his cavalry uniform, especially after a visit at the end of the week with Jackie to the camp, where they acquired information on the defences. But Helena also realised she had to control her own emotions to keep her safe, and felt some bitterness towards this and the coldness that she had to approach things. And as we move to the end of 1942, the war fundamentally changes the path which the Germans took. With the US entering the war, they started repercussions in their own country towards the Jews, who the systematic murder was starting to move towards its horrible crescendo following the Wannsee Conference, where they discussed the extermination of those considered unworthy by the state. They emptied French orphanages to get rid of the weak, with Helena's friend and now fellow agent, Pierre Michel, himself captured and sent to a concentration camp, though he was lucky enough to actually survive the war. On the 2nd of January 1943, the Germans demanded the French hand over 250,000 people to start working as forced labour, that's men and women, and this marks the start of the Germans moving towards a total war, something that the Britain, USSR and America had already been doing from much earlier in the war, and it was due to the fact of keeping pure stock in the German race and Hitler's obsession with Aryan mothers, the idea that women shouldn't go to work, etc., because of the hierarchical government that they have, in part the way that they felt that their society should be ordered. In 1943, Helena was tasked with infiltrating the milice, the French military police we discussed earlier, by Colonel Marquet, so went to see a former friend of her brother's, both of whom were fighting against the Germans in Africa, called Jean. Jean was a high official in the milice and held the rank Directeur de Service de Répression Antinationales. Now, that's a hell of a thing to say. And looked after operations in the southern sector in the capital Vichy, and had affection for Helena, which she used to her advantage, and included fellow agent Xavier. They were childhood friends from the hometown of Aix, and he was himself a son of a French military man, so they'd actually moved from place to place together. This proved to be a wise move, as in a moment Jean would ask about Helena's brothers and their whereabouts, given he was friends with them earlier in their youth. But Helena stumbled unsure as what to say when Xavier stated they were both in North Africa. Knowing that the truth would soon be known anyways and would betray them later, it was better to give this information up now. His quick thinking impressed Helena and helped her understand again just what being an agent was all about in occupied Vichy France. At this point, Xavier suggested Jean could help her look for work. Now all she had to do was wait. Much to the disgust of his fellow milice officers, who objected to a woman working for them, she went to do so as doing menial office tasks for them at the Hotel Radio in Vichy. Due to the nature of her work, she had access to filing and names of which she would destroy. These would be subjects on little cards that the milice would be looking out to try and get. She would read the pieces of information, hide the parts in her bra, and dispose of them down the toilet. She herself reflects on how fortunate she was for this to not have been discovered in The Secret War of Helene Deschamps. It's the source that I'm using for a lot of this documentary, if you want to call it that. She would remember being targeted, and she would remember who was being targeted, and even managed to smuggle out some letters of operations, giving this information to Xavier, but also leaving no paper trail behind. Key to staying alive, something she realised as an agent very early on. One raid would accelerate proceedings for all involved in the resistance with a positive denunciation of the underground leaders of Grenoble. They intended a raid of which Helena passed on the information to Xavier, but as Jean goes to leave for this, he requests Helena comes along with him. One raid would accelerate proceedings for all involved in the resistance with a positive denunciation of the underground leaders of Grenoble. They intended a raid of which Helena passed on the information to Xavier, but as Jean goes to leave for this, he requests Helena comes along with him, leaving her feeling much dread as to what might lie ahead. As they approach the milice post in Grenoble, the men started to unload the cars when an explosion happens and a flash of light. Then the smoke fills the air, and the metal, wood and glass all fly from the grenade which was thrown by the Free French Forces, also known as the FFI. Helena was lucky to be in the doorway, but thrown back and marked by the glass and splinters. She sees a milice soldier ahead injured and feels conflicted as he's a fellow Frenchman but also a collaborator. And this is something that many must struggle with as they go through the years and the retributions that will follow the war. Jean's fury led to more drinking and rages, making life even more intolerable, and things would take a worse for the turn next. A milice agent named Michel showed up at the office with some papers. He was suspicious enough to check Helena had put these papers away and left satisfied. Upon realising they were using the same envelopes as were available in our office, she saw the opportunity, so rips open the envelope, knowing that the letter inside she can read before they come back, but she has very little time to check, and sees 3 addresses for the towns of Manosque, Aix, and among the names were members of her very group. Quickly marking a reason to go, she meets Xavier at a hotel the next day. They return to the office. Jean, hungover from a lavish German party, lavish the night before, opens the letter and immediately summons his subordinate, a man named Rolf, who kept glancing at Helena suspiciously as they discussed what to do. Helena left and went to do some food shopping, and when returning, Rolf was waiting outside her hotel room. This startles Helena, but she has no option but to let him in, and he follows her into the room and closes the door. Now, if at this point I would suggest that if you are uncomfortable with parts of domestic abuse, etc., or want a trigger warning for here, this would be a good part to do, to skip, say, a minute or so into the documentary. I will actually clip it into the notes in the edit. So as he follows her into the room, the door closes. He slaps her hard across the face and demands she sits down. As he ransacked her room, searching for evidence, with Helena asking, "What are you looking for?" with his response, "Let's stop playing cat and mouse. Obviously Jean likes you, but I am not blind to your game." With Helena realising she's in great danger, thankfully due to her not leaving any paper trail, Rolf can do more than another slap and threatens torture, even trying to cut some sort of deal, but Helena stays strong and states, "I don't understand what you mean," looking into the distance and using her acting skills to persuade him that it may in fact be Michelle working in the office that is the source of the leaks. Rolf, acting alone without authorization, could do no more or suffer his own consequences for breaking the structure of command, something that Hitler himself firmly believed in, and really to those below him. And so he tells Helena to stay away from work for a few days and to let her bruising heal, and says they will forget about that evening. But what Helena said this evening would not be forgotten about completely, and on this I will speak more as we go through 1943 and the years of operation. Before the night is finished though, she slips out to call Xavier. It is no longer safe for them to meet at a hotel room under the guise of two lovers for the call. When Helena goes back to hotel radio to work, she finds out Jean has been moved due to all the failures, and having lost her job, she and Xavier decide to try and return to Marseille, so Helena goes to pack her things, goes to leave, and then a knock comes at the door. And the man waiting for her was from the Gestapo, and he wants to know if she is Helene Deschamps, which of course she has to reply yes. He unsheathes his Gestapo badge with the German eagle and presents papers to Helena with the signature being of a Hermann, someone who she's seen the signature of before on documents for Jean and knew that they were friendly. Xavier was cycling to hotel to see her being led out with no acknowledgement made to keep each other safe, as she was led into the car and into the night with no knowledge of what they wanted from the Gestapo. Upon arrival to the German police station, she was introduced to Hermann, the officer, who says, "I have heard nice things about you from Jean," much to her relief. And when asked about her brothers, she says, "As you know, Herr Hermann, not all French people have the same political opinion." He then asks for her to spy for the Germans in the town of Royat, where she is to befriend the local population and find out information based upon the secret army in the area. With obviously her not being able to refuse such a request, she must go. She meets Xavier in the Café Lucien and tells him of her fear, as she is scared, not knowing what outcome there will be if she returns with nothing, but knowing she cannot betray those that she is working for. Xavier confronts her and tells her, "Play along, go to the Royat and come back. Tell Hermann you could not find any leads and act stupid. You're not supposed to be a secret agent." And as she leaves on the train the next day, he tells Helena that he loves her, which made Helena feel silly, as it's something she'd never really considered before, especially with somebody who she considers such a good friend. She returns to Vichy a few days later empty-handed and reports to Hermann, who flies into a rage, calling her incompetent and stating to Jean that he only knows pretty legs. But thankfully Helena was able to leave, but she was bruised and tired from her ordeal. And Xavier says, "You might not be cut out for this," and suggests she takes some time to go home. Chapter 3. Helena goes home. Helena returns to Aix to see her mother, but on coming home finds an empty house, and her neighbour explains her mother is on holiday, later confirmed by Marquis as being kept in safe in Nice, and she goes to bed hungry, having barely eaten due to the restrictions of rations, reduced for around 800 a day for the ordinary population, from about 3,000 or so to originally part before the war. So Helena, hoping Xavier might have something better to eat, goes to meet him, but as she moves into the pitch black, she hears movement and then feels the bore of a gun being pointed against her, telling her to go back inside. This is the second part of another trigger warning, is because what I'm going to discuss in here will happen, it will be in some detail, as it's basically impossible to avoid. Upon locking the door, he proceeds to punch Helena hard, drawing blood, and demanding she tells him everything she knows. As she states she knows nothing, he kicks her over and over for every denial, with the last kick aimed at her shoulder, to which the pain was so intense she passes out. Coming to later, she sees him stealing her objects and enjoying every moment of his power, blaming her for losing his job, and taking great pleasure in the punishment he wished to dish out for her denunciation. Helena realises she needs to figure a way out despite her frail state and the pain in every part of her body aching, making her thinking unclear. Michelle wants them to get a train to the police station, and Helena states that she cannot go out with all the blood on her clothing to which he realises she is right and lets her go to get changed. Helena realises this is her chance and goes not to her room on the top floor but her sister's room on the lower floor, and while pretending to get changed lines up a chair against the window to climb out of it, and as he approaches she leaps out. With shots being fired, Helena runs for her life, leaping over the garden gate, but catches her leg leaving splinter wounds, but runs off into the nights with shots firing at her as she tries to run along to Xavier's across the town where she's hidden and helped recover, her arm put into a rudimentary sling and fed and given time to rest. Realising the danger her appearance has, they dye her hair and cut it drastically and use a lot of makeup, which she remarks herself she looks 10 years older, and so then they leave to go to Leon and get to the train station only to see a cattle wagon led there, with the open secret of the Nazis there with the sights and smells that stayed with Helena all those years later, and the guards smashing a glass bottle from the hand of a Red Cross volunteer passing it on to one of the train occupants just filled her with more determination and rage. She then went on to Paris, wary now of the dangers that she could encounter, given the large German presence in the city, but still in receipt of her Malise pass. She was able to use the German-occupied hotels, a good place for her to lay low for a little while and regain her strength and stay out of anybody's way. As the winter comes though, she decides to go back to the south and help with the fight. But on the train there, the train itself comes under fire as the Allies were intensifying their bombing campaign against the infrastructure key to the war machine for the Nazis. As the Germans know things are going badly, repercussions against their opponents become even more severe, but this only intensifies the resistance to the occupiers. On December the 28th, 1943, Jackie and Helena were supposed to be meeting an operative from the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, precursor to the CIA, and had to persuade Arnaud, the leader of their local mafia, to let them and meet them work with the Americans, something that they were not very happy with a lot of political infighting obviously happening. There was a huge amount of infighting full stop. There was obviously the communists, the Free French, there would be the remnants of the Vichy government. All these people would obviously want to have a stake in what France would become, not what France was at that point, and obviously that would change significantly over the next period. The evening they arrived, a B-17 bomber was shot down by German anti-aircraft, with their high-pitched whining thuds piercing the air. They investigated the distance to see an airman come away from the wreckage, but then shot by the Germans, wanting retribution for anybody who helped the Allies and leave the corpse to rot, leaving a stern warning for everybody left up aboard on a piece of paper put to the tree. But Jackie and Helena decided that they could have to give it a proper burial and convinced the local caretaker of the graveyard to take payment to dispose of the corpse, something that has to be considered reckless but brave and selfless from the two sisters. The next day, when Arnaud arrives with the OSS operative, introduced to them as Neff, he was a parachuteman that had come in with others to start a sabotage commando unit, the sort of one that when we were talking about the inspirations in James Bond, are the sort of ones that Ian Fleming himself was actually inspired by to create James Bond. Part of the lineage of these sort of operations, despite them not being as upfront in that way, and the excitement and the Hollywood sense that we get from these ones, the Saving Private Ryan element of it, there is a great deal of part that was factual to elements of the war part, in terms of the engagement between soldiers, the way fire works back and forward amongst the game. I think there is a little bit that you could say that is closer to the in-close fighting, and I think Underground is very different to the first game and even Allied Assault, which are more about the actual overall war, and this is much more about close room fighting, which is a little bit closer to what we're looking at when we're talking about somebody like Neff is a good example of that. At the meeting, they tell Arnaud about hiding the corpse, to which he is furious about, given the risks that he and the OSS agent then leave. But Helena protests about the cost of the gravedigger, something that she's handed money for by the paratrooper who's leaving, and he gives them enough money to eat and asks them to meet in Avignon at Arnaud's, and they'll discuss what to do next from this point onwards. Upon arrival, Arnaud was not present at the next meeting with Neff. Helena presumes because he didn't trust him implicitly, and here she was told that herself and Jackie were to be part of Jacques 1, the headquarter being in Lyon in the Secret Intelligence Division, tasked with detailing troop movements, ammunition dumps and anti-aircraft positions, and occasionally needing to help with sabotage missions, all of which is different to the infiltration work they had undertaken before. Obviously when they were working in the local Macquarie, it was a lot more cycling, checking and just looking at sites, looking for where troops might be moving to for the local resistance, and obviously looking to help the local resistance get people on board. It wasn't quite so the same way that the OSS or the SOE in the British version of the same organisation, the Secret Operations Executive. They were much more involved in these small-scale operations and infiltrations, especially arming and aiding the resistance and making sure that they could disrupt the Germans behind enemy lines. The contact for their information were Neff himself and two other agents, Petit Jean and the other was Elox, with predetermined meeting places, and if anyone was caught in code names burnt, then they would be told that the station was closed and be pointed towards the location of the second Jacques station. And upon leaving Avignon, they were introduced to Petit Jean, someone who would play an important part in Jackie's life. For the next few weeks, they spent time cycling around the countryside, giving locations of anti-aircraft placements and troop movements. Not quite the excitement of the Medal of Honor footage provided here, but the truth of trying to hide in plain sight and teamwork over groups coming together to build a larger picture is so important when it comes to this sort of intelligence work. However, more like the Medal of Honor underground style missions on the 10th of March 1944, the two sisters go to help the Macquarie unit back in the south as a favour to their Colonel Marquet, who'd retired from operation due to heart disease. He's actually mentioned in the game himself as well. You'll have seen his name come up a few times. I've tried to make sure the details when his notes have popped up, they are in there, because they did try to actually use the consultation information and records to build this game. And it's where they raided a Vichy-controlled prison in aid of freeing the commando leader, Barissoni, who'd been caught infiltrating the jail and trying to free the prisoners. He was caught actually in the act of freeing the prisoners. That's when he was discovered. So the two sisters went to the same prison, going to the guard, speaking to him, knowing that he was actually an infiltrator named Sauvignon, who was asking to see a prisoner. So they asked him to see the prisoner, should I say. He protests, puts up a show, pretends all the sort of things going on, and then tells them to come back tomorrow at 7, while slipping them the key in the food basket, letting them know that the guards eat at 8 quietly, and as they leave to go and meet their fellow partisans. The next day, the partisans then raid the jail, freeing most of the prisoners thanks to the surprise of such a good quick second attempt. But unfortunately, Barissoni had been taken to the Gestapo, and he would not see the end of the war. Unfortunately, he was tortured to death by the Gestapo. Moving towards the summer months, Helena was tasked with escorting 2 airmen to Spain from Avignon, and maps and sketches needed to be dropped off to the Allies. As they travelled towards Perpignan, the airmen slept. Helena was stood by the door as an SS captain moves towards her, offering her a cigarette, to which Helena overhears the guard saying all luggage will be searched. Knowing what they have on them, she decides to use the captain's advances to her advantage, accepting his offer of lunch and taking the luggage with her as they search past those on board, also past the airmen, and making an excuse to leave the captain and board the train. She then makes her escape. While this itself does mean that she'll come under suspicion, it was the only solution and incredibly quick thinking which saved all 3 lives in the end, and countless knows how many others based upon the maps and observations that were taken back from there. After this, she had to lay low for the summer as she was wanted, and along with that she wanted to take a return home to see her mother, but unfortunately she got a frosty reception. When she did see what had happened, she saw why, because the Germans had taken over the household itself. They'd also taken up local residents in the hotel, and so Jackie and Helena went to meet Petit Jean, who'd become Jackie's fiancé after they'd grown close doing missions in Helena's absence over the last few months when she had to lay low after the incident with the airmen. He tasked them with getting information on German troops in the lower Alps ahead of the invasion of Italy. The area that Churchill thought would be Hitler's soft underbelly, but proved to be anything but. Now, when it soft underbelly, this is the invasion through Italy, going through the Alps, which is notoriously incredibly difficult, but it was almost like became a second Gallipoli to a degree for Churchill, in the fact that the invasion going through soft underbelly proved to be actually incredibly slow, or the war in France proved to be more, probably faster, although the help going from Africa to Italy made more sense to make that invasion next. They cycled a hot long miles to the hamlet of Merak, where they came across some German camouflage positions, listing the positions to pass on to the radio handler, and so they left, continuing to note the Germans moving into positions all along the coast, when suddenly a P-47 aircraft came out of the sky, firing at the convoy that was amassing, and the sisters take refuge in a nearby ditch, waiting there for a few hours before heading forward and towards the Durance Bridge, a heavily guarded area. However, as they approached the area, they saw it had been bombed. The good news, this meant no Germans or passage required. The bad was the water was too deep to cross, and so the bombed bridge and the wires that held it together just about would be all they would have to make their way to meet their handler. They edged their way out onto the cables, searing hot from the sun and the flames burning all over, with Helena feeling faint as her sandals fell below, but thankfully they both managed to make the crossing and go to meet Petite Jean and the radio handler. They arrive at the location only to find that the underground have taken over this area, but the sisters have forged papers showing that they're working for the Nazis, a necessity for an agent working, but in this case leads to their imprisonment, and all they can do is wait for Petite Jean to arrive, or they will be executed as traitors, given retributions were high in this period, and so the pigsty awaits with all its smells, lice and filth, and you can imagine, and just as things seem at their worst, the fighting between the French communists and the Free French forces, with them bickering over these hostages, but all the sisters can do is wait for the morning to come. After no rest, they await Petite Jean, but he is late, and this is not common to happen, leaving them in an even more perilous situation. They are summoned by the French Free Forces, who declare they are traitors to be executed, and so are taken back to the barn to await being called. At 12 p.m, they are called to the bore of a gun. At 12 p.m, they are awoken by the bore of a gun, taking them into a building where they are made to sit and wait, and in walks the leader of the parachute drop section, codenamed Bibendum. The two sisters cannot believe their luck, but this moment is tinged with sadness, as the night before, on their way to meet them, a German sniper had shot Petite Jean, and for Jackie this is a truly painful moment, and the orders to go to Cahmplain almost pass her by. They need to travel by foot 15 kilometres to meet the radio operator and give their information, with the extreme heat and a mountain to climb ahead of them. The sunburn and exhaustion set in, but they struggled to meet the radio handler, only to find that he had moved on, and so stayed where he had to get some food and rest, unable to join in with the local populace celebrating their liberation from the Germans. Helena awakes to find Jackie crying, ready to talk about her loss, when they hear noises outside. Jackie thinks this is people celebrating, but when Helena looks out, it's the Panzer Division come to claim reprisals for the previous day's celebrations. The girls escape using a back garden gate and stay on the narrow pass where no vehicles could go, to stay out of the German clutches coming up a hill. They see a young pregnant woman coming down the road, and then suddenly 5 German infantrymen come into view. The girls hide, and the rest I do not want to discuss, as in the book This Moment Stopped Me Cold. They escape, but the sights they've seen mark Helena's memory forever, and as they come down the path and into the waiting communist member who is to help them, Jackie is struggling to manage. Helena convinces her to push on, so they get a car and driver. They go to meet the Americans and take off into the night. Unable to use any lights, progress was slow, and as Helena had been in the back, Jackie had asked her to switch places, and as they did so, they suddenly came under fire from the Germans, who'd come across them in the dark. The driver manages to lose them, and as they reach their destination, it's only then that Helena can see that Jackie's been lethally shot in the skirmish. With the help of a local farmer, they bury her sister underneath a French flag, Helena asking a local priest to pray for her sister, but the pain is very real for Helena. Even as she writes her biography, this is something you can really feel. Helena spends the next few weeks gathering herself, and being given a dress and new shoes feels like a true luxury. And it's in this period, and just before she goes away to her new assignment, that she meets Lieutenant Peterson, someone who becomes vital to her, especially after everything she went through over such a short space of time, And so we move on to the last stage of our story and into the war in France. The final chapter, the end of the war. So our last chapter will set up to reflect on the person and how the game was influenced and shaped by Helene's input and own story. But before that, there's one last story to tell. And there was still great disruption given D-Day landers were still unloading even at this point, and Helene was tasked to travel to Arbois to get more information regarding the Germans and their movements in the area. Her handler said she could get the information in any way she liked, so Helena went towards the farms and spoke to the farmers there, spoke to the people working on the path, and to work out the movements of the Germans that had been there. As she was having lunch with one such farmer's family, the Germans suddenly appear, with Helena shoved into the food cupboard, but thankfully they just wanted to loot the place before retreating back to their own lines, given lines were very flexible in this period of the war. Helena left them a gift of money for the trouble she could have caused, and they made her way to meet her handler. But she found herself nonchalantly in an orchard the handler had actually warned her about, and then she hears the rumbles of tanks, and then the uniform of the Wehrmacht. Throwing herself into a ditch, hoping they will pass, she sees the barrel of two Panzer tanks waiting for darkness to fall. Falling asleep, she awakes at night and makes her way over and down the hill, and using a low stone wall, she slowly makes her way down, avoiding branches to alert the people or dogs. When one branch snaps, she hears the fire of an MP40 and runs vaulting the wall, nearly landing on a German soldier. And she runs zigzag into the orchards, avoiding the fire as it rips through the branches, tearing at her clothes, trying to desperately get away to make it to Arbois and into the arms of the 136th Division, where she can finally rest safe. And for Helena, this draws an end to her time working for the OSS, as she could speak no German, and the campaign of France was over by the 8th of May. Post her operations, Helena still had some work to do, as she could do some at the Swiss border, helping translate with the enormous undertaking that was rebuilding Europe after the war. While undertaking this operation, Lieutenant Peterson and Helena's relationship becomes known, and so he's posted to Germany to work. And a few months later, Helena receives the news that he's actually died in the fighting, leaving her absolutely distraught, wondering what she can do after such losses. On discovery, just a few weeks later after this, of her childhood friend Xavier also being killed while he was in North Africa fighting. So Helena decided after the war to move to the US, where she meets her future husband Forrest E. Adams in the army. And my thought on the two sisters, Helena and Jackie, is that the story I think they share, while it's Helena's story directly written down, you can feel how much of it is involving her sister in it. And I guess why she didn't want to talk so much about her sister's elements, because it may be too painful. But I think they were both incredible women. They risked their lives in incredible ways, and it takes an unbelievably large amount of courage to stand up when there's so much threat around you. Because as I explained prior, the Gestapo were equally as the Gestapo relied as much on local information from populist denunciations, so somebody saying their neighbour was bad or their neighbour was good would get them favour with the Gestapo, and the Gestapo had relatively few agents for an organisation that seemed so overreaching, and it's because their power was their network of communication. That same network works against them in this regard, with the small cells also using the same type of information to denounce or not do. That's why retributions become incredibly high in this period of the war. Helena did detail some more of this in the book as well, but I think if you want to know more about those things, then The Secret War of Helene Deschamps is a fantastic book. Her name is Helene Deschamps, but that's the pen name that she chose to use. I can't recommend the book highly enough to anybody else. And it also leads me on to what I will be covering next time when we come back. I would like to actually cover the second part of this, which was originally going to be included in this section, but I'm going to cover some more stories, because while I said female agents weren't common, it didn't mean they didn't exist. There were enough of them to make a significant difference. In Mission Improbable, the book I'm basing a good section of the second part on, will be about exactly that kind of detail. I think it's important to talk about these stories, especially the groups that aren't usually brought up into it, because the James Bond caricature is of a man agent being secret and doing all these wonderful things. And I think that the reality of agency work is that there's a lot more split than that seems because of the nature of the work itself. So now I think I've talked enough about Helena. I could dig into a little bit more detail about the part, but I really just wanted to provide an overview of who the woman was and the reason that the game used her story as an inspiration towards it, as well as asking her to consult on both games. So if you only wanted to know about that part, then this part is just about the game. So Medal of Honor came out in the year 2000 for the PlayStation 1, and there was a Game Boy Advance port for 2003. The Game Boy Advance is a particular favourite platform of mine, and it's something I will come to talk about in Mission Improbable, but I want to cover that next time and really just stick to the PlayStation 1 game this time. I think on my part of it, the game is still an absolute blast to play. It's got a fantastic mixture of music, which I think is really, really important, and you're getting the good sound effect in terms of the sound of the guns, the I wouldn't say authentic sound effect because they don't really sound authentic. Most games and guns in games don't sound authentic. But what I would say on that, the game is still an absolute blast to play through. Just make sure if you're going to do it, use an emulator. And if you're doing it through an emulator, this game's still an absolute blast to play. Though make sure if you're using an emulator to enable an analog DualShock and choose the second configuration to play this like a modern shooter with twin sticks, R1, R2 to shoot, all that kind of stuff. Like just makes it a lot better fun to play. It's actually applicable to the original Medal of Honor, something not that many people are aware of. You just need to go into it. I'll show you how to do it on RetroArch above here, as we're watching in the background. So it's fun-packed, it's film-influenced thrill ride, and even includes some dancing dogs for that lovely Wolfen-esque Nazi madness of the Anna Erba, which is the Nazi science division, which is the only real way I can describe it, because science isn't really the right word for them. And Himmler himself, a topic I'm sure I'm definitely going to cover at some point. I really would like to go into more of what they believed, but I think that that's something that I'll do when I've got more skill at these type of things, you know. So while Helena consulted on them, they obviously weren't so keen on the bike riding elements of the game, because as you can see in the background, it doesn't really match in with that. And it's what I was trying to say before, is that when you got this thing of real life agency work, a lot of it is busy work, a lot of it's quiet stuff, because you don't want to be caught. You want to be the undiscovered leaf, do you know what I mean, the leaf in the forest sort of Sun Tzu Art of War type thing. You want to be able to be hidden and not able to be spotted easily, so therefore the Resistance isn't really just about all these sort of highbrow James Bond-esque commando operations. While such things did exist, and again that's something I will cover in a future episode when I intend to cover a little bit more about that sort of thing. So Underground gets very tricky towards its end, which I'd say deducts overall from the fun, with the dancing dog stages, despite being a lot of fun in terms of watching the dogs dance and being fired at by Alsatian rocket launchers. It does become a particular drain, but the music, having that John Williams style Spielberg-esque stuff from DreamWorks, really helps it a lot. I think the gun sounds really help, and the German chatter is very 1950s war movie in that escapade rather than real life. The guns that play again is fantastic Foley work from the point of view of a game. It's not so much fantastic work from a point of view of reality, I guess, but that's not the idea of these things. I think that's something that media always is going to be flexible with. You can't really make everything that realistic, otherwise it'd be incredibly boring, because real life isn't really all that entertaining after all. The shooting remains responsive, and the weapons are pretty much all fun to use, with the crossbow Big Joe being a genuine in-use OSS assassination weapon. They used rubber bands in a triangular frame, so basically they could fold it down and keep it in a small bag, It was incredibly small. There was actually one called Small Joe as well, which was more of an actual crossbow. The theory being is that Big Joe is more of a slingshot because it slings the thing forward using the rubber bands rather than actually fires bolts like a crossbow does using the firepower that it does. So what I could say to it is the detail shines through. Uniforms, papers, everything resembles a part of resemblance to what would be done. As I was talking about with her things to do, providing papers and parts throughout the entire action. That's what happens in real life agency. They do these things. Since this channel is for a pie man, I feel that pies out of 5 is a fair way to score my games. For detailed gameplay and telling the story of the agents who kept us free, this game deserves 4 pies out of 5. There are other agent stories to tell, and one was also loosely connected with these games, but that story will come next time along with, as I said, on Mission Improbable, as I want to shine a spotlight on these parts of history you don't always see covered. Helene and the main character of Underground do not share a similar story, but her work in detail inspired them to make something truly special, where parts of her story could be told, and expect more books and media and their influences in game, or similarly, to be covered here. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed at all, leave a like. Thank you.